Andy Weir, my mortal enemy, we meet again. So, I recently finished the Project Hail Mary book right on time to see it on the big screens all in a single day. Normally, I'd make a video about the movie and another about the book, but then I thought, why not try something different for a change? A double feature. No, I'm not Dominic from Lost in Adaptation. He is a much better YouTuber than I am, already established while I'm just doing this for a hobby. If you're seeing this, hi Dom, I'm not trying to invade your turf, hope you enjoyed this video. I'll first talk about the book, discussing as few spoilers as I can and being absolutely scant in details. And then, when I start talking about the movie, I will assume that you've only seen the trailer, which already spoils a lot of the book. So if you want to go blind, which I do recommend, stop when I finish the book review and go read it. The novel was written by Andy Weir, who also wrote The Martian, and the movie based on his book, released in 2026, was directed by the duo of Phil Lord and Chris Miller, who also had a hand in the Lego Movie, Spider-Man, Spider-Verse, and so on. In both cases, the story is the same with some diverging details. A scientist, played by Ryan Gosling, wakes up completely amnesic. He doesn't know who he is, nor where he is, all he knows is that he is in space, and on his shoulders lies the fate of mankind, and more. For the style, if you had to read The Martian, you see little change here.
Look at the characterization, the tasteful use of science to advance the plot. Oh my god, it even has humor.
I've read a lot of styles, and I'd say that Weir's biggest advantage over most authors is that he is insanely good at dosing. It's not flawless, but I haven't seen anyone separate, switch and dose like this motherfucker. His main character has the right dose of smart with some dashes of being a lovable dork and some doses of being relatable without being distant. You create a character who can be as a genius as you need while still doing some pop culture references or talking like a panicked idiot. I mean, come on, who doesn't admonish themselves in their own minds? I do, often. Side characters also have enough traits to make them quirky and relevant, but just enough to make them do their jobs as they need in the narrative. Weir's style is both his greatest asset and his biggest setback. That because he barely describes anything besides what's crucially needed for the plot to progress. Our protagonist, those around him, nope, nada, zero. At best, his descriptions deliver vital information, like the protagonist noticing how his arm is muscular, an object that demands immediate attention or something happening. And these descriptions are dished akin to a conversation, fitting very well the fact that this book is narrated in first person and adding some flavor. So, when it's time to go technical, he will get dry and straight to the point, but when it's time to do some musings, he'll get somewhat silly and indirect. For example, I grab the handle and twist. It turns. My domain is about to grow by at least one new room. I push the hatch upward. Unlike the connector between the bedroom and the lab, this hatch slides to the side. This next room is pretty small, so I guess there wasn't room for the hatch to swing in. And the next room is... LED lights flick on. The room is round, like the other two. But it's not a cylinder. The walls taper inwards towards the ceiling. It's a truncated cone. I've spent the last few days without much information to go on. Now, information assaults me from every direction. Every surface is covered with computer monitors and touchscreens. The sheer number of blinking lights and colors is staggering. Some screens have rows of numbers, others have diagrams, and others just look black. This style has the enormous advantage of being insanely easy to process, so even if this book was longer, you'd be able to finish it in 2 or 3 sittings. Weir also is really good, but not as good in balancing action and science. But every style has its flaws, and Weir's is no exception. In this case, what makes his book insanely easy to read also doesn't make it very memorable. As I said before, his descriptions are just as needed, which robs several scenes from impact and grandeur. They are completely simplistic to the point of somewhat frustrating in parts where there should be an inspired and beautiful description of something breathtaking. But, well, it ends just at the bare bones. Other authors were able to weave something of a more evocative prose alongside the technical of the sci-fi themes, but not here. While he is really good at dosing character traits, this comes with the caveat that there is very little to differentiate the protagonist from Hail Mary to Mark from The Martian. The same thing happens with his side characters. They are quirky enough to give some flavor to the narrative, but only just enough. Nothing beyond the necessary. So, if you are seeking something beautiful or inspiring to read, if you are seeking deep or striking characters that will stay with you long after the book's closed, go read another book. But hey, honestly, it does what it has to be done, and avoids the pitfall of being boring, so I can see the wit in using the charm of the characters to cover the flaws. I don't see his style working on a third person or a more complex novel though, but it's absurdly obvious how he got so famous so fast. And the story, pretty much akin to The Martian, Project Hail Mary offers enough science to make everything credible and instigate interest in studying more, but not enough to bog the narrative too much. Speaking of, he also kept the style of switching the narrative in order to not let things get too stale. In The Martian, it was between Mark trying to survive and NASA trying to save him. Here, it's between our protagonist's present and the past. He's amnesic, thus, as the narrative proceeds, he starts remembering how he came to be inside the spaceship, and thus, whenever the narrative needs a break between all the science going on, he remembers something of his past. This is also a creative way of dictating the pace and giving it structure. By the way, the pacing isn't brisk, it's somewhat consistent, with some bumps on the way, but overall no problems here. So, we follow our protagonist through space. The first part of the novel is focused on the mystery of who he is and what is his goal, and the rest of the narrative will switch to the hurdles he finds alongside the way in order to reach said goal. The process is more or less the same. Trouble found. Since the novel is in first person, we see how his brain works and what he is thinking in order to surpass his problems. And from there, we are guided on how he deals with said problems. It's classic and done well enough here, but sometimes the pacing suffers because there is too much science going on over minimal stuff. But the advantage of science exposition is that you can safely skip it without losing what's going to happen or nuances over the plot. But the ending feels a bit exhausting due to problem after problem showing up. So in the end, I do recommend reading this novel. It's nothing jolting, but it instigates scientific research and logical thinking, and in these times of anti-intellectualism and science denial, it's always good to be reminded where we can go with science and cooperation. I'd honestly compare it to one of those fancier snacks, like a burger made by one of those hipster joints. Do hipsters still exist? Anyway, instead of an old McDonald's, different flavors and sauces, different meat, but it's still a burger and fries. Something easy to digest but not as memorable as a fancier diner. Okay, now from now on I will have to comment on more spoilerific details of the novel, so if you want to read it completely blind, stop this video right now and go to your nearest library. Everything alright? Then let's do it. First of all, the protagonist of the novel is Grace. Yes, the Grace of a Hail Mary. At least Weir is better with wordplay than Kojima. A likable teacher who drops everything he's doing to help save Earth from aliens. No, not the usual fare of aliens and spaceships, but rather tiny microorganisms that feed on the sun's energy, named astrophage. Grace's characterization is solid, especially considering that he is the main character, having the same skeleton from Mark with dorky behavior and pop culture references, but having some differences, such as refusing to curse even when thinking. Side characters mostly appear on his flashbacks, fleshing out how he came to be in a spaceship, and again, they are solid but not overly complex or deep. And then Rocky comes into the picture, the alien that you've probably seen in the trailers, and he's as adorable as you would expect. I will leave the comparisons between the book and the movie for later, but Rocky is an interesting piece that reveals more of Weir's speculative fiction. Through Rocky, Grace talks about other planets and other means of life, other cultures. I don't know if Weir's descriptions of hypothetical life are accurate because biology isn't my field, but I can say that they are rock solid. The little alien is a good addition to the story and his personality synergizes well with Grace's. He is practical, peppy and somewhat bossy to counter Grace's speculative, downer and sometimes scatterbrained personality, also preventing from just getting overly stale with everything only focused on Grace. The journey stops to briefly show both interacting and learning each other's languages, and as an information scientist myself, I felt a bit sad on how the process of learning to communicate with Rocky was simplified. But yeah, it's quite understandable why. After all, Weir already pulled off a lot of hypothetical science. I couldn't ask him to make something akin to Arrival. Really good movie, by the way. I myself would have used a children's books. Yeah, people underestimate how children's books are a really good source of information about new languages. They join forces and tackle the astrophage, and since the astrophage is just a bunch of single-cell alien creatures without much of a personality, there is no big bad to face off, just a bunch of problems that come in the way of the research. As for the bad parts of the story, as I mentioned before, sometimes the scientific explanation do get a bit boring, resulting in a more cranky pace. After all, not every single little thing needs a true explanation, especially in a more tense scene. It's not really that bad. In fact, I'd say that the worst part of the story is the ending, more because it has 3 different climaxes in succession, but even then, it just left me tired and frustrated. Asking things to
Yes, get on with it!
rather than furious. And the themes of this book aren't overly complex, but are well integrated within the story. We see the survival of mankind and the struggle for food laid out clearly, with the flashbacks in Grace's story showing that his boss, the totally not Amanda Waller, Strat, doing increasingly horrific things in the name of launching the Hail Mary project and thus humankind's survival, while his desperation wanes with the clarity of his mission. There's also the fact that everyone mentions how important food is sooner or later, and there is the constant reminder that millions will starve. Alright, with that, let's hop into the movie. And right out of the bat, I have to say that the photography was inspired by ancient British customs, because they dug out Stanley Kubrick's Mummy and made tea with it. If not downright snorted it. Lots of shots are clearly inspired by Kubrick's 2001. Yeah, the shots are quite good, and many could be made into wallpapers. The visuals translated well most of the novel, but some spots felt weird, like Rocky's ship or Rocky's own design. In the novel, he's described as a rough rock, while in the movie he has lots of articulated points over his main shell. And in the novel, it's described as a triangle with weird angles, but in the movie it's... Another point of contention within fans would be the Hail Mary itself. The movie changed the overall design from what was described by Weird and added a video room. I understand why, and I'm pretty neutral to it. After all, if you want a more chill movie, the last thing you want is to make it feel as if your protagonist is in Das Boot. And the video room is meant to alleviate the stress of being literal light years away from home. But it also dilutes the despair present in the novel, where everyone is in a deadly race, so everything that isn't 100% crucial to the mission is cut off. Now, to complement the photography, I have to say that it's so nice to see that the directors were so inclusive that they hired an insomniac alcoholic to be the cameraman, because this camera just won't stop wobbling. The directing spread wobbling like an Italian mama spreading garlic through everything, including ice cream, especially ice cream. Dialogue scene, wobbling. Thinking a long shot, wobbling. There's even wobbling in a simple panoramic of the ship. You don't need wobble shots in space, especially when there isn't any action. And please, stage an intervention on whoever is in the editing room. They are on so much crack and caffeine, they could replace Jason Statham on Crank Free. Jesus fucking Christ on a flaming tricycle, this is one of the worst editings I've seen in a movie for years. I can literally count on one hand the number of times that there was a shot that took more than 5 seconds, and the vast majority of them don't pass 3 seconds. There's only one good cut in the movie, and it's the review of the alien ship. Everything else, including Grace starring in all at an alien planet, is horribly edited. A simple conversation has at least 3 angles with shots that don't last more than 3 seconds. And joining this awful editing with the wobbling resulted in a visual unholy abomination. I ended with a serious headache and I'm a motherfucker that play bullet hells to relax. Last but not least, I also have to give a backhanded kudos for whoever inserted all this product placement in a movie about science. It's constant and it's annoying. The acting will be insanely short since there are only 3 characters worth of note in the whole movie. Ryan Gosling is an immensely versatile actor who can play a serious role with contained acting such as Blade Runner or Drive, or go into a more comedic route such as Barbie. Here, he plays Grace insanely close to his character in The Nice Guys. I like the movie. A nervous wreck of a smart man who is trying to solve the mystery, and he fits the character like a glove. Strat, Grace's boss, is played by Sandra Hüller. I saw her in Anatomy of a Fall, I hated that movie, and her acting chops are still good. Her character is far more contained and bittersweet, contrasting sharply with Grace. The last star of this movie is Rocky, the alien. Designs aside, the directors chose to have a mix between practical effects backed up by CGI, which was absolutely the right choice. Since it's a puppet, we can see Ryan Gosling talking with it instead of that impression where he is looking at nothing, and thus credibility for a scene skyrockets. The puppeteering is really good, and its puppeteer, James Ortiz, Jesus, that hurdle is something to envy, also voiced the character. In the novels, Grace just learns to talk to Rocky, which the movie understandably adapts to having Grace do a mobile translation device. Both make a really freaky and adorable character that mixes very well with Grace even with the differences in writing. Because, yeah, since this is a movie adaptation of a book, inevitably it had to adapt a lot of stuff for the big screen. In terms of the adaptation, I have to say that it's weird. I have seen lots of adaptations, and yeah, the best one so far is still Lord of the Rings. But Hail Mary isn't bad. But it's not necessarily good either. There is the usual fare of cut content and changes to the plot, and some of these changes were actually really good, and others were bad enough to induce some minor plot holes and make characters look like idiots, but I can only talk more about that in spoilers. The biggest change, and the more controversial one, is the tone. Phil Lord and Chris Miller are specialized in comedies, and while Project Hail Mary has some comedic beats, and really funny beats if I may add, it's still a race against disaster with problems being tackled through science, and translating such movie through the lenses of comedy wasn't pretty. It gave me the impression that an accessible book was hit by the PG-13 ratificator gun or something. I'll admit without shame that some scenes made me chuckle, but this translation dumbed down a lot of the material and heavily flanderized the characters. There are moments that could have been perfectly used to deliver concise exposition and explaining the science to the viewers, but those are downright wasted for the sake of awkward comedy or product placement. There are rumors of a 4-hour version of the movie that has all the explanation, but so far I will talk about what we have. Grace was quirky in the novel, but at the level of a normal person. Everyone has their quirks after all, and the movie makes him squirm, scream and yelp at everything, cranking his traits up to 11. To counterbalance, Strat was turned into a more polite figure, a change that I liked, and Rocky turned into the counter-quirky roommate, which I didn't like that much. Bizarrely, several of his habits were downright swapped from the novel for the sake of humor. For example, in the novel he hates to be seen eating, while in the movie he loved showing off how he eats to Grace, which he finds it disgusting. And of course, already making it in adaptation and turning up the quirky awkward humor resulted in a hurried frantic pace. Weird wasn't subtle, but this movie makes everything extremely blatant as if they didn't trust the audience. For example, it cuts the start where Grace needs to remember his name, shortening it to 2 or 3 scenes, which is sadly a bit counterintuitive with the narrative structure in the book with the back and forth. It's not that bad though. The need for a brisker pace removed lots of problems of the novel and added some charm to the movie. For example, Grace needs to verbalize his thoughts to the audience, and thus Carl the guard was created, offering more of a friendly dynamic. Another addition that I really liked was how, in here, Grace actually has a video diary to talk about his progress, and while in the movie it's used for buddy roommate comedy purposes, it's something that I really missed in the novel. Several points of the book were actually well simplified, and my biggest beef with the ending was erased. But again, I can't go on without delving into spoilers, so I will say that while a lot was lost, it's still a movie that explains well what it's about, so people who just watched this movie won't be lost. I recommend reading the book though, either before or after tackling the movie. For the soundtrack, the music was composed by Daniel Pemberton. Wait! I know this motherfucker. The 3 or 4 people who follow this channel will remember when I talked about the bad guys. And Pemberton was the one to bring such a really good composition there, and here he's just as good. In Hail Mary, he keeps things fresh by bringing new instruments and compositions according to the situation, mixing with bizarre yet fitting licensed songs. And the music is just as well placed, with the more rumbling instruments such as drums being used in more frantic space scenes. In the end, the book is a clear recommendation. It's not a must-read, but it's enjoyable, brief, and easy to finish in 1 or 2 sittings. While Weir still has lots of glaring flaws in his style, he knows how to compensate with some characterization and knowing his turf. As for the movie, it's not bad, but it's something that I recommend in watching only after or before you read the book. It's good to give it an extra bang, but as an adaptation, it's okay. Andromeda Strain was infinitely better at making a science movie thriller. Now, for spoilers. So, my 2 big problems with the book are the end and the twist. In the end, we have a non-stop extravaganza of not-needed crises where Grace has to escape the planet where he found the anti-astrophage. Then he has a small crisis when the anti-astrophage starts dying. Then he has another crisis when the anti-astrophage starts to eat his fuel. Then another crisis when the anti-astrophage escapes its enclosure and eats his fuel again, leading him to the realization that Rocky's ship is in danger. The movie basically cuts everything between the escape of the planet to the anti-astrophage escaping the enclosure, and uses the time between these events to tone things down, which is insanely better. The twist is that Grace was a huge coward that chickened out when the scientists meant to be sent into this mission of Hail Mary died, and he turned into a last viable option. The problem in the book is that we never see Grace acting like a coward. Much on the contrary, he actually gives up his job as a teacher, teaching science to kids, in order to gun for a place in Hail Mary project research, which requires a lot of courage. Especially grievous when he quits a job in order to help those kids the best way he can, through science. The movie actually corrects this by making Grace a more obvious coward from the get-go. He never has the chance to give up his job. Strat just grabs him and takes him with her, and then he decides to stay. The problem is in the movie is that Book Grace trained with the astronauts and knows the ship inside out because he was there with Strat every step of the way. He knows how to operate the heavy suits and space equipment because he tried them, and most important of all, he has an insanely rare gene that enables him to survive several years in an induced coma. So the pool from which Strat can choose astronauts is insanely shallow. Since the movie skips the training parts and makes no mention of the special coma gene, this makes Strat look like an immense idiot who tossed a completely untrained newbie into space without properly looking for replacements. Another big issue with space travel tackled in the novel, a bit wonkily, was the hunger. Grace only has limited food resources that dwindle every day, and his choice of either saving Rocky or returning home comes from the fact that the trip to find Rocky would take months, and he doesn't have resources. On one hand, the novel makes it clear that each step of Grace's research takes a very long time. On the other, he is reduced to food reserved for coma patients in at best 1 or 2 years, which brings the question of how the hell People on Earth expected 3 astronauts to find a solution for the astrophage so fast. The movie ignores this plot point entirely, even giving hints that Grace could grow food within the ship. But at the same time, it removes the only reason why he doesn't return home at the end. So I'd say that regarding to changes, the movie evens itself out. It has good changes, like how instead of endangering Grace by letting him out of the ship to slowly drop the cage to gather samples, the movie just made him attach several spools on the ship. And it has bad changes, like the ones I just talked about. So this is the reason why I think that you should see both. Well, that will be all for today. Thank you very much and see you all next time. Remember to like and subscribe.